welcome everybody. Welcome, and welcome to those joining us online. First of all, I'd love if everyone could join me in welcoming Norman Ola to Edge City, Patagonia. Amazing. So I am extremely excited for this conversation. We're going to cover a lot of ground over the next 90 minutes. I will gently lead us through a story arc that covers 3 of Norman's books, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. Norman has written about a wide range of topics, but generally with a through line on how drugs and psychoactive substances have influenced human history and big important events that have often been overlooked by historians and the way that we perceive this, these important parts of history. So I'm very excited to get involved today. First of all, Norman, how are you doing? Welcome. You just arrived, so you're like fresh off a 30-hour flight.
Is it working? Yes, it's working. Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's quite amazing. I had only known Patagonia as this kind of literary topos that Bruce Chatwin invented with his book, and now suddenly I am in Patagonia. Yesterday I was in Berlin, and then I spent like 16 hours just plane time. You've all come here, so it's not a big deal. But I'm still. My soul is maybe still somewhere else. I don't know. Let's see. Let's hope that the soul will come also for this talk, because it's all about the soul.
Yeah.
About my work. It's literature. So I'm very happy actually to be at Edge City and also learn about Edge City. I find it highly fascinating. We just chatted about the idea of the network state, which is also something that I've been fantasizing about the whole time. So I'm very curious about what we're going to speak today.
Yeah, I think we will meander our way through and end up there and have some ideas for kind of the future of the world. But I'd love to start maybe at the beginning of a book that you wrote, I believe, almost 10 years ago. And you had this interesting almost transformation where you were writing novels and then suddenly you found yourself deep in the archives in kind of Nazi history looking for traces of drugs in the Third Reich. And maybe you could just tell us how that began and then we can start from there.
Well, I am a novelist, so I invent things, I write stories, and I published 3 novels when I was, started in my 20s, and they came out one after the other, and then I was about to write the 4th book, but I was living in Berlin, and suddenly I was taking a lot of drugs, actually, to be honest, going to clubs, because my best friend owned, and still owns, Club of Visionaries. I don't know if you are familiar with that club. There's someone up here that has been
a fan in the audience.
Club der Visionäre. So I've spent a lot of time in Club der Visionäre, not in the club, but only in the office. That was, it was not really an office. It was a very wild place. And I didn't write for like 12 years. No book was published. My father told me I should switch profession, and it's not going anywhere. It really didn't go anywhere because I just started books, but I couldn't finish it because I already had the next great crazy ideas for the next book. But what I did, and this I realized later on, I really did proper drug research. I really understood drugs. It takes a while, to go really to the bottom of it, because then I was really ready when I asked, after like 10 years of not finishing anything, I asked my friend Alex, who is the brother of Gregor and a DJ, resident DJ at Club der Visionäre. I said, what should I write about? What will ever make a book again? He said, well, just write about Nazis and drugs. And I was like, but Nazis didn't take any drugs. And this came out of a deep understanding of National Socialism, because I have been growing up in West Germany, and we learned a lot about, at least we did learn a lot about National Socialism. Like, we were really educated, like the credo of West Germany was, this should never happen again. So we have to know what fascism is. So we like get it, in school. We actually learned quite a lot, but there was never any talk about drugs because no one really knew about it. But Alex said, no, they took drugs. And I said, how do you know? I mean, what's this? You're on drugs yourself right now. He said, yeah, sure, I'm on drugs. But they did take drugs because this morning, or this evening, or last night or something, this was in 2010, a friend of his who is an antique dealer had bought an old medicine cabinet, and he just told me this like 2 days ago. I always thought it was from an old apartment, but he corrected me 2 days ago. I asked him, well, how does it actually, how was that again? It was a medicine, like like a cupboard from an old pharmacy that this antique dealer, his pharmacy went bankrupt or something, and then he just bought like the old like furniture from this pharmacy in West Berlin, and it still had in 2010 original Pavitine tablet. I mean packages of Pavitine tablets, and this antique dealer, being a good friend of Alex, he took them because it said on the package that they contain methamphetamine. And this antique dealer said, methamphetamine but these were from the 40s. But he wanted to try if it's really like German chemical quality product, and they worked really well. And I met him actually. I filmed him a few years after after the book was already out. I met this guy for the first time. I only had heard of him from Alex, and he told me that he and his boyfriend took like methamphetamine for like a month from this pharmacy, and he said it was the best month we have ever had. Like we were so productive that we had the best sex, and then we partied, and because this is not crystal meth, basically this is methamphetamine. The German pharmaceutical company invented this in 1938, patented it, and it was like one pill had 3 milligrams of methamphetamine. It's still a bad drug, but it was a high quality bad drug, basically. But I only had heard this from Alex. So Alex also took it in 2010, and he said this is really was quite strong, actually. So I became interested because I realized, well, there was a product in the 40s that contained pure methamphetamine. And this went against everything I had learned as a kid about National Socialism. So I Googled. There was not much on it, but there was one historian from a southern German university, and he had examined how methamphetamine was being abused by or used by the German military, and how that led to the successful Blitzkrieg campaigns. And he had concluded, and this is like just a two-page academic text, his conclusion was the Blitzkrieg would never have been possible without methamphetamine. And that was quite a radical statement, because no one in Germany had ever heard of this, and it's, no one in the world had ever heard of this, and it's a, big piece of, the puzzle of World War II. So I decided then to actually go into, meet that historian first, and he was very open about his research, and he said, yeah, there's a lot more, I just don't have the time. And he told me exactly where in the military archive of Germany to look for the files, because there was one professor responsible for the whole meth program for the German army. So I found everything. Like I was in the military archive for a few days, and I had like information that no one had ever seen before. And I thought, this is great for a novel. Like I'm gonna write like how the guys were in the tanks on meth, like charging into France, and how then it all crashed. And I mean, it's a great story. Tragic, real event, but great story for a novel, I thought. But then my publisher, and I wrote a 1,000-page novel. Like I was partly on methamphetamine myself because I wanted to test it. I'd never taken it before. I asked my weed dealer, I told her, can you get me meth? And she's like, no, that's bad stuff. I don't want to touch it. Then like a week later, she said, okay, I know a guy, and I have a gram for you. So I had a gram of meth. I thought of Paul Schrader, the author of Taxi Driver, one of my favorite movies, who had kept a loaded handgun in his drawer just to be like on edge while he was writing it. So I thought that this would be like my loaded gun would be like 1 gram of crystal meth. And I took it myself, which made me write a lot. And I also realized something, that it's not really good for writing, because you just produce a lot, but your self-criticism is lower because you feel like you have such a high. So it's not really good. So the novel was not so good, but it had 1,000 pages, and I presented it very proudly to my publisher, and he said, well, it's okay, you know, but he was really fascinated by the topic, obviously. He said, you have to write a nonfiction book. And I was like, kind of, for 2 days, I was like, not really happy about this suggestion, because I thought nonfiction books are boring. And I had never written one. And I said to him, they're boring. And he said, not necessarily. Only German historians write boring nonfiction books. If you already look to England or America, there's already a trend of writing kind of fluent and novel-like nonfiction books. And then I kind of reinvented the genre and wrote a page-turning nonfiction book about Nazis and drugs. And everything in that book, Blitz, has sources, is correct. It's like an academic apparatus in the book, but still it reads. It's a fun read. I think it's a funny story, actually. That this is kind of the genesis of Blitzed. It's not funny, but it is entertaining, because it tells a story that we all know, World War II, in a different way, with the same outcome, but still it's told in a different way that makes you actually understand it much better. You're much closer to what actually happened. That was fascinating to me.
Yeah,
I never planned this, but it just happened.
I think that's something that's been very fascinating to a lot of us who are interested in history, who've read the book, and finding out that this is obviously a key part of the history and yet has never really been covered. And also, interestingly, your kind of academic thoroughness, even though you're not a historian, has been commended by some of the leading historians of the period. So just, props to you for doing that archival research. And
I thought every historian does that. I thought all historians always go to their archives, but later I found out no historian does that, because it's too much work. They're too lazy. They just basically use other work and create their own work from other secondary sources. To actually go to the primary sources is like unusual.
Maybe they don't have access to pervitin or methamphetamine.
I mean, I was stoned a lot in the archives, which is kind of nice, because the archives are such kind of boring places in a way. But if you're stoned, it's like becomes a bit surreal, and the archivist really comes with the original documents, and also your fantasy kind of goes wild when you.
Oh wow! All right. So let's talk about what you found in the archives. Let's talk about the history. It's about to be the invasion of France, and I think something like 35 million tablets of pervitin are ordered by the military. So maybe run us through what's happening there. How did that begin, and what was the outcome during Blitzkrieg?
I mean, the interesting, or the irony of the story, is that the Nazis actually did portray themselves as teetotalers. Hitler was the cult around Hitler had always this focus that he had no private life, was totally drug-free, didn't drink alcohol, was a vegetarian, was just like a saintly servant of the German people. That was the propaganda, and the Nazis officially were an anti-drug government. They were actually the first anti-drug government in the world, basically. I mean, you could say that the Catholic Church, and we come later to Stone Sapiens, which is like a broader view, but Catholic Church also was an anti-drug regime already, much earlier. But in the 20th century, the Nazi Germany was the first modern state that had a very strict anti-drug policy. And then they took all these drugs. That's kind of the irony. Because they were obviously a capitalist type performance-driven society system. So when in 1936, during the Olympic Games, an Afro-American athlete named Jesse Owens won, I think, 6 gold medals. and was faster than the German superhumans. There was rumor that he must have been on something. The 36 Olympics were the last Olympics without any doping checks at all. You could basically take whatever you wanted. And then so they said like and Benzedrine was already on the market. Benzedrine is an American amphetamine. So, and there's never proof that Owens actually took Benzedrine. Maybe he did, but it's no one ever proved it. But there was the rumor, and then this German chemist, he said, this can never happen again. We must invent a better amphetamine, and he invented methamphetamine. I mean, it had been already synthesized in 1917 in Tokyo, but he found, and he researched this, no one knew about this, it's just a Japanese chemist once made methamphetamine, but nothing came out of it. So the Tembler company in Berlin with his chief chemist Hauschild, he found a new way to synthesize methamphetamine. It came onto the market in Germany. It was a big success because it was like today, now we all drink coffee or something, every day we take something to increase our performance, or most of us anyhow. And in Germany, there was nothing really on the market. Germany didn't have many colonies compared to other European Western powers especially. So coffee was not really available, and suddenly there was methamphetamine, and it became hugely popular in 1938. There even came quite quickly a methamphetamine-laced chocolate onto the market, where one little piece had 9 milligrams of methamphetamine, and this was marketed especially for women because the Nazis wanted women to just kind of stay at home, clean the house, and make like all these boring things at home. So at least they had methamphetamine-laced chocolate. There was like posters of this very happy German housewife high on crystal meth, basically cleaning the house really well, I would imagine. While the men, they had fun, going to war on meth, so it was like a real separation that worked for National Socialism. Because actually then there was one professor responsible for performance enhancement of the Wehrmacht, the German army, and he had taken methamphetamine himself, Pervitin, that was the brand name, and he liked it himself, and then he read the first studies that had been done in German universities, which had come to the conclusion that it lowers your fear level and it decreases your need to sleep. And he thought these two things are perfect for a soldier. And it's actually still being used today by, I've spoken with I took in the summer, I took ibogaine with US Special Forces vets, and they had told me that they also, when they had to go on longer missions, they always take an amphetamine, not maybe necessarily methamphetamine, but these amphetamine stimulants are very good, not good, but effective for soldiers. So the German army really got into it, and they got into it at a point when Hitler, who was determined to attack the West, was again and again confronted with the resistance of high command, because the people in high command in Germany were highly intellectual, rational Prussian generals who said, we don't have a strategy. There's the French army. French army was supposed to be the best army in the world, and the British military, also very good military. They together, they will of course win against us, same as in World War I. So what's the strategy? But Hitler just had this obsession. We have to attack in the West after beating Poland. Now we have to beat the West. So then there were 3 tank generals who said Germany could go through the Ardennes Mountains, because the French and British troops were in the north of Belgium and in south of France, but not really in the Ardennes Mountains, which is a small mountain region in Belgium, and no one had ever thought of moving a whole army through this eye of a needle, basically. And then Hitler said, yeah, that's what we have to do. And then they said, the only problem is we have to march for 3 days and 3 nights without stopping, so they don't come from the north and the south and kind of crush us in the middle. So how is this possible? Because a human being cannot stay awake for 3 days and 3 nights. We have to rest at night. And Hitler just said, no, the German soldier can do anything. never has to rest. I don't have to rest. They don't have to rest, which is bullshit. You have to rest. But then the methamphetamine, then the Ranke, this professor, like when he heard about this problem that was unsolvable, he said, well, now we're going to use this use methamphetamine, and we just going to make it possible. And so they kind of put everything on the methamphetamine card and ordered 35 million dosages, which were then distributed on May 10th. So May 10th, there were millions of German soldiers, especially the tank soldiers, swallowing methamphetamine, and then the advance was very successful. They actually, the tank general Guderian, who was one of the three next to Rommel, these three tank generals who invented this plan, he said to his men, I asked you to stay awake for 3 days and 3 nights. You actually stayed awake for 17 days and 17 nights, which is probably an exaggeration, even on meth. My friend Alex, the DJ, he can do like 5 days and five nights. I don't know if 17 is possible, but that's how the Blitzkrieg was basically invented. Or it just happened. It was not really invented, it kind of happened. So they stumbled into this like strategy, and it really worked out. And I described this in the book, and no military historian had ever described it this way, that had ever figured this out, basically how it worked. But then they said this is exactly how it worked, and you can actually see in the archives like how many pills were distributed, how in which way to the medical officers, how and which divisions were taking how many pills. It's very well documented because the Germans are very, very good at documenting everything.
There was a tank general, Rommel, who you mentioned. He eventually became the Desert Fox in the North African theater, but he was part of this push, and I think he and his crew were particularly big fans of Pervitin. And I'm curious if you could maybe touch on that, but also just what is the experience of, you're young, you're in a tank, you're invading Belgium and France, like that must be a pretty crazy thing. Were people writing letters home? Were they describing this? How did it go?
Well, human beings don't really want to kill other human beings, and also even Germans don't want to invade like foreign countries all the time. It's a very unnatural thing to do. And I read quite a few reports about like depression just before May 10th. No one wanted to go to war. Like the morale was really low because everyone thought it's going to end like World War I, when there was just a stalemate for 4 years. They were in the trenches, and it's like totally senseless and totally ridiculous. And so no one wanted to fight. But when the methamphetamine kicked in, and it kicked in, like it was basically like everyone was taking it, and there was this movement of the tanks, and they were going like into enemy territory, and suddenly the mood completely changed, and they became euphoric. And also on methamphetamine, you it's not like on a psychedelic where you broaden your consciousness or your horizon, you narrow it actually, so it becomes narrow, and then you don't question. I mean, they didn't question it. They were like 18-year-old German guys already indoctrinated anyhow, so they just went with it. Like they just went with it, and they were successful, and they kind of got into like the intoxication of warfare. So it really worked. It was a chemical enhancement of the indoctrination, basically.
Right, it's like the first drug was the propaganda of National Socialism, and the second was the Pervitin on top of it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about patient A. I think this is kind of the more surprising thing to many people, and a doctor called Morel, and maybe you can tell that story.
I mean, just to round up this story with Rommel, because you mentioned Rommel. Rommel is this famous tank general. I mean, later became famous. He's like a legend in Great Britain because he was fighting Montgomery in the desert. That's why he's called the Desert Fox in North Africa. And Rommel really liked crystal meth. That's why I call him the Crystal Fox in the book. But you can see with Rommel when he took and his division took crystal meth and didn't stop at night. They were also that this is what because the Wehrmacht, the German army, was kind of they thought of themselves as this honorary military apparatus that would apply all the rules and be an ethical army. And but when they were on crystal meth charging into France, they started to commit war crimes. Like there's this report about Rommel going through a French village at night where the French army had basically camped, because the French army also had a drug of choice, which was red wine, which had been quite successful for them in World War One. Because red wine does kind of boost your morale or makes you feel better, but only like if you're fighting in the trenches and it's cold and rainy. But if you're like fighting an enemy that's on crystal meth, it doesn't really work because it does make you tired in the evening. So the French guys were sleeping, and then Rommel, like high on crystal meth, charging through and just running over them and not really even noticing, I guess, that they were like running over sleeping soldiers like on the side of the road. So this is when it kind of changes, and war crimes start to happen already in France. And then when Germany invades Soviet Union, this is when the army really becomes a criminal or terrorist organization, I would say, and commits war crimes like non-stop. Yeah. So Hitler himself, when I said to this military historian that I'm also going to examine Hitler, he said, "No, Hitler is just, this is not interesting. This is not real. This is this kind of yellow press. Hitler, why Hitler?" But Hitler was and is really interesting because he's at the head of the state. And when I checked out the records of his doctor at the Federal Archives in Germany, I could see the record of when they were looked at in the last, like, since the war ended, and I had been like third person to look at them. So Hitler being the most examined historical figure in the world, having this doctor that was with him every day, and he spent more time with Morel, his personal physician, than with any other person. And Morel, like, meticulously makes notes of every day he spent with Hitler and what he gave and what he injected at what time and what military decisions had to be made or what other decisions, and how Hitler was before the injection and afterwards. And no one had ever looked at this stuff. That was quite amazing. I was quite happy when I realized that, because I was like, I would like literally a fly on the wall. And I'd never been so interested in Hitler, I guess. It's interesting somehow, but like the first thing I read was a report of the SS describing this kind of overweight doctor, Morel, coming and going with Hitler into this room, closing the door, and then coming back out with a syringe and then washing the syringe in the wash basin of the SS, and like no one knew what he was doing inside. And I became really curious, like, what did he do inside? What drugs did Hitler take? How did that change his behavior, basically, or his strategies? And everything was actually there. Everything was there in these notes, which were kind of hard to read because doctors always have a terrible handwriting. But the archivist gave me like a magnifying glass. And then my drug research from Club der Visionäre really paid off, because Hitler was taking like stuff that I could only evaluate because I knew drugs, basically. I mean, one of the most interesting substances was Eukodal, and Eukodal is now known as oxycodone. And actually, Eukodal I didn't know, but Alex, he said, I showed him the copies, the DJ Alex, and he said, "What? He took Eukodal. Are you insane?" I said, "What is Eukodal?" He said, "Well, that's oxycodone," and he took 20 milligrams intravenously. That's like the highest high you can imagine, and then you can like tell a story, much better if he like goes into a meeting with his high command, military briefing, and just injects oxycodone 20 milligrams intravenously before. Then you can understand better why generals were still impressed with his like charisma and his like total conviction that this is gonna go like this way, and so it's quite interesting, actually.
Can you describe the feeling, just so people, if they don't have context, like what is Eukodal, what is oxycodone?
Well, oxycodone is the opioid that created the opioid crisis in the United States. It's a painkiller. But that's what if you just take the pill, it's just kind of numbs you, and you kind of have a warm feeling, I guess, and you're not really concerned with anything anymore, with any problem. But if you that's why some people crush the pills and sniff them, or like the hardest, the strongest effects, obviously, when you inject it, when you inject oxycodone, then you have a really euphoric making high that also gives you mental clarity. So it's not like you're not drowsy in any way. You're like really like, you feel like, I've never taken it, but Alex described it to me, and Morel described how Hitler was feeling. You basically feel like on top of the world, and you're really, this is how you're supposed to feel. Like it gives you a high that I guess Hitler really appreciated, because he became a junkie. He used it every second day after a while, and really could, in a way, project that charisma that he originally had, but kind of lost when all the battles were lost. So then he started using this chemically, this artificial charisma. That's how he used it, like a pharmacological weapon to boost himself.
Is it true, am I remembering correctly, that the reason that he started taking Oikodal was that there was like a particular trigger moment where I think Mussolini was trying to leave the war and he knew he had to convince him and he didn't want to go, and then the doctor was like, here, try this?
Yeah, this was in 1943 in July. And Morel, the doctor, was not really, he was not a pro-opioid kind of guy. He was just a doctor that believed that through medications you can improve someone's performance. He was a VIP doctor in Berlin. He would like give actresses, or like anybody who would pay his high prices, he would give injections. Basically, it was an avant-garde Dr. Feelgood, and he had given Hitler mostly vitamins until 41, and at 41 he started giving opioids once in a while. Hitler had the flu in 41 during a very intense time in the Russian campaign. So Hitler wanted more than vitamins, and he received an opioid for the first time, which made him able to go into the briefing and make the decision. And then in 43, Mussolini, the Italian dictator, basically had enough of the war and wanted to leave, and so they had like a crucial meeting between the two dictators, and Hitler was kind of upset and depressed that he didn't want to go into the meeting, because Hitler was also like avoiding. He also liked to like stay home and basically do nothing and kind of talk about philosophy and architecture. But now he had to really like convince Mussolini that he would stay, and this is all very important. So he asked Morel again to give him something very strong this time, and Morel gave him this Oikodal, this oxycodone. And Hitler liked it so much that on the way to the plane, he already asked for the second dose. He got addicted to stuff quite quickly, and from that moment on, he was a big Oikodal fan. But Oikodal really was a drug back in the days that was used by many doctors, especially, who had access to it and who knew the effects. So it was also like writers would take Oikodal. Apparently, it was a very pleasant high. It's just the only problem with Oikodal is it makes you addictive, obviously, because it's an opioid.
How did that meeting go with Mussolini?
Well, there are like a few reports, and they all say that Hitler was so high on this Oikodal that he spoke basically non-stop for like 3 hours, and Mussolini was not able to even like say that he was like considering to leave the war effort, to leave the axis of evil. So Hitler was really kind of riding the high and speaking non-stop, and then Mussolini just never had the chance to actually make his arguments, and Italy stayed until another year or 2 years until they finally left the war. Morel in the evening wrote in his notebook, "I think I made history today."
No way.
Yeah.
Wow. It's so crazy that you got to see these notebooks like day by day as it's happening. It seems like, so there's this film Downfall and kind of like the last, I guess, few months or the last like end of the war, and you see Hitler like really in like a terrible state. And so it seems like he really degenerated over the last couple of years at least. Do you think the drugs were parts of that? And that's kind of why this is such an important part of the history, right? To actually understand the decisions that were being made whilst under the influence or whilst in this like addictive state.
Well, next to all the vitamins and the opioids, there was another form of drugs that Hitler really liked, and that those were hormone cocktails that were made from slaughtered animals. And when Germany had occupied the Ukraine, Morel had the monopoly on all the organs of all the slaughtered animals in the Ukraine. They were all shipped to his pharmaceutical company, and there he made he experimented with pig's liver extracts and weird glands from sheep that he turned into medicines that were supposed to boost your energy level. And Hitler was very happy to play like the guinea pig basically for Morel, because these medicines could not be brought onto the market because it was a war economy. So Hitler said, "I'm going to test them all myself, and then if I like them, they can be brought onto the market." And he basically ruined his health with these hormone concoctions because they're quite dangerous, and they were also fabricated under dubious hygienic conditions. I mean, it's really quite weird, actually. I mean, the weirdness of National Socialism, you could kind of see the absurdity and the perversity, just in Hitler's drug taking. So he basically self-ruined his health. National Socialism also fascism being a self-destructive system because it's full of hate towards the other. So that hate, why do you hate the other? Because you basically hate yourself. I mean, National Socialism was a self-destructive movement. So Hitler was also a self-destructive person. So Morel and Hitler, they were kind of teaming up to... I mean, Morel later on had he was afraid that Nazis would kill him because he basically ruined Hitler without wanting to do that. But Hitler kind of demanded more and more drugs and more wanted to experiment and wanted to test out more and more different stuff. So what was your question? I'm sorry.
Just around the degeneration of it and kind of those.
Yeah, right. For me, it's pretty clear that the degeneration of the health came from this self-medication. And this movie, The Downfall, I don't know if you know this movie. It's not bad, but it doesn't discuss the drugs at all, so it kind of misses the point. Because no historian actually has an explanation for why did this somewhat healthy person suddenly become a very, very unhealthy, like a wreck. Hitler in the end was like a wreck. It's shaking and talking nonsense, basically. And this has a lot to do with drugs, and then also with opioid withdrawal. Because when he goes to the bunker in 1945, there's no more opioid available because the British bombing raids had also destroyed the Merck company who was producing the Oikodan. And apparently there's an entry in Morel's diary in February 1945 and he really was a very heavy man, and he describes how he's riding on a motorcycle through bombed out Berlin, going from pharmacy to pharmacy, trying to find opioids for Hitler. So this is a Hollywood-esque scene, I would say, and he couldn't find it anymore. So Hitler really becomes kind of has cold turkey and kind of he loses World War II and he withdraws from opioids. So he really felt like shit, basically, which is poetic justice, I guess.
I'm very fascinated in this part of history, and I feel like I could talk to you about this for hours, but I do want to keep moving and make our way to Tripped. the second book that we'll talk about today. This has quite a different, almost more emotional core. It feels like it started with your mother in some sense, and I'm curious how you started to think about LSD in this context, if you're open to sharing.
Sure. I mean, it kind of started still with researching Blitz, because I was at one point in the archives of the former concentration camp of Dachau, and the archivist there told me that the SS had done experiments with psychedelics, which is something that I'd never heard before, that the Nazis were interested in psychedelics. But he said most of the SS reports had been taken by the US military when they liberated Dachau. So I thought, this is actually interesting. I would like to find out more about this, but I didn't have access. I didn't see these papers yet. So this started a next book, Tripped, which is basically the stories about why did LSD not become a normal medicine, like what went wrong. I was curious about the very early years of LSD development, and why did the Swiss pharmaceutical company Sandoz, one of the world's leading pharmaceutical companies, why were they not able to bring LSD onto the market? And I kind of suspected, or I hoped, that this was somehow linked to the SS experiments with psychedelics at Dachau, but I didn't have the link yet. So I just started researching LSD, and as I was planning my trip to the archive of Sandoz in Basel, Switzerland, I came across a white paper of Eleusis, an American startup company developing or trying to develop psychedelic compounds into medicines. They had found in a phase 1 study that low dosages of LSD seemed to work against Alzheimer's, and my mother is suffering from Alzheimer's. So I discussed this with her and with my father. And my father had been the vice president of a state court in Germany, a very high judge, a man of the law, how he describes himself, not a drug person. But I still kind of said, why don't we use, LSD? And he's like, well, why, if it's helpful against Alzheimer's, why is it not in the pharmacy then? I said, this is exactly what I'm working on for my new book. So he said, okay, then I would be quite interested in your new book. Like, what is the true story of LSD? Why did it not make it into the pharmacy? Because I have to believe that it's dangerous, otherwise it wouldn't be illegal. So I went to the archives of Sandoz, which is now Novartis, one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. And it wasn't very easy to find the evidence, because it is a company archive, and in contrast to public archives, there's no find book. And this might sound like, so what does that mean, find book? Find book is basically the table of content of an archive. So in a public archive, you have the complete overview what's in the archive. The find book might be like 1,000 pages long, because some archives are huge. It's usually you access it through a computer, but at Novartis there was nothing. And I said to the archivist, so how can I find what I'm looking for? Because I want to see why LSD was not being turned into a medicine. And he basically said, you have to ask me, and I will look in the archive, and I find whatever I find, I give it to you. So that was it's a very frustrating situation, because I realized I had to. I mean, if you're interested in LSD, you probably know that Albert Hofmann discovered LSD in 1943, kind of by accident. He was the leading chemist of Sandoz. But his papers have been examined. Like, there's a famous bicycle ride, like he takes it, then he experiences the first LSD trip, then he rides back home because he's like a bit quite disoriented actually. But this doesn't really, and Hoffman was always interested in LSD. He was always pushing for LSD to become a medicine. But the guy who actually did not make it, was not helping him, was the CEO of Sandoz, which was Arthur Stoll. I realized this at a point when I'd read all of the Hoffman papers. the archivist gave me all the Hoffman stuff because he gives that to everybody who's researching LSD, but you don't get very far. You just read, you know, how Hoffman discovered it, and I wanted to read the papers of the CEO, and he was like, no, I don't have time. Like, he was kind of not wanting to show those to me. And then because we discussed this beforehand, this is kind of a funny scene in the book Tripped, because I just say to him that I asked him, do you want to see LSD actually, the archivist? He's like a Swiss, you know, employee of the company. They said, well, LSD, it's illegal. I've never seen it. Yeah, sure, I would like to see it, but where would I see it? It's illegal. I mean, and I said, well, I have some with me because I had just bought some, you know, for my mother already. I was sure I could convince my father and my mother to try it. So I had it with me, and it actually had, it was given to me by a friend of mine in Zurich at the train station. It had the old logo of Sandoz printed on the paper, which is a coincidence. So I showed this to the archivist. He's like, it has the old logo of the company. How is this possible? And then I actually said to you, well, I give you one. I gifted him an LSD trip, and I said, you could put it in the archive here, so at least you have like one trip. And he thought that was funny. And then he said, so, okay, what do you want to see? And I said, well, I want to see the papers of Stoll. That Stoll was the name of the CEO. And he said, okay, I'll bring them to you. And then when I looked through the papers, I realized that Stoll had one best friend since the 20s that he always corresponded with, a German chemist named Richard Kuhn. They had the same mentor, Jewish-German biochemist named Willstätter, who had received a Nobel Prize, I think in 1914 or something like that. And so they had been like the two main student of this guy, and they had always shared their research for decades. And then when Stoll Hoffman discovered the LSD in 1943, also I saw the letters, like he wrote to Kuhn, we found like this stuff, we don't know what it is, but it works so powerfully on the mind. What do you think about it? And the interesting thing is that Kuhn at the time was the leading chemist of Hitler. He was researching in Heidelberg, and his job was to find a truth drug for the Nazis, because the SS had run into problems not being able to extract all the secrets they wanted to extract from the enemies, even when they applied torture. So the idea was, we're going to apply a truth drug. So Kuhn, when he heard about LSD, he became very interested and actually requested LSD. And I found a letter then where he thanks Stoll in October 43 for receiving half a gram, which is not so little actually, because LSD works in such small quantities. And that LSD then kind of makes its way to the concentration camp of Dachau and makes its way to these SS reports, which then are discovered by the American military when they liberate Dachau, which then leads the American military to their keen interest in LSD, because American military was interested in all the Nazi research, basically, especially nuclear weapons research, but then also, you know, biochemical research and pharmacological weapons research. And this is why then the CIA, which was formed in 1947, became very interested also in LSD. And this is actually the reason why LSD Sandoz was not able to put it onto the market, because the CIA, one guy from the CIA named Sidney Gottlieb, who created the MK Ultra program, flew to Basel and met Stoll in the CIA, in Stoll's office, and basically said, "This is not gonna go on the market. We're gonna exploit that, because we're gonna use it as a mind control substance now." That's kind of the story of Tripped in a nutshell.
So just to wrap that up, there's this kind of like fascinating almost accident of history that when at the exact time that LSD was invented by Albert Hofmann, his CEO Stoll was, you know, still in contact with the chief chemist of the Nazis. He shared this new invention with the Nazis. At the time, they were very interested in a truth serum That's how the Nazis got it, which is how 2 years later the Americans got it. But the Americans saw it through the lens of, oh, this is like some potential Nazi truth serum. We might need that too in our upcoming fight, because obviously the Cold War had already kind of started. So that they saw it through this lens, not through like, oh, this could be a medicine, this could be, you know, something else interesting. They thought this was, okay, let's try this in our own MK Ultra experiments.
That's what the research shows. I mean, maybe there's even a bigger story behind it, and Kuhn was already kind of wanting Sandoz to develop LSD, but I didn't find any evidence for that. So it seems to be a coincidence, actually. Not a conspiracy, but a coincidence. But at the same time, I mean, there was legit LSD research from the mid-40s all the way to into the 60s. So there was at the one on the right side, there was the mind control research done by the CIA, also using American universities to do LSD research at research institutes, which the CIA funded through foundations. So the research institutes that were doing LSD work often didn't know where the money was coming from, because drug experiments are always costly because you have to pay the participants. But so the CIA was able to kind of shape what questions were being examined. But there was also free LSD academic research going on, which was very valuable. But in the end, Sandoz was just not allowed, basically, by the CIA with their partner organization, FDA, which controls, you know, what substances are allowed and which are not, and FDA and CIA work together. Sandoz was not allowed to bring LSD onto the market, so it never really had, you know, it never got the chance to become a mental health product. And then other mental health products, antidepressants and antipsychotics and all these things that are still on the market, you know, came onto the market.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's talk about MK Ultra. Like, what was that? What was that program? How did it develop over time? What were the experiments they were running? And then maybe let's tie it into like the context of the 60s and the, you know, what became the counterculture movement.
Well, John Lennon once said we have to thank the CIA because they brought us LSD. I mean, LSD was an obscure substance, you know, even has a weird name, you know, no one knew. I mean, what is LSD? LSD might be completely unknown if the CIA had not popularized. That's actually true, which was not really the intent, you know, probably not. I mean, Frank Zappa thought that was even the intent of the CIA to actually make it popular, because that would prevent people who are against the system to become really like socialist fighters against the system. Like they were all just, you know, taking acid and making love. But I don't know if the plan went that far. I think it was kind of, I think the CIA opened Pandora's box and LSD spilled out and then couldn't be stopped anymore. And I actually think there is a value in the counterculture movement. I think it really opened up a lot of doors, even if it didn't lead to an actual revolution in the United States. At least it led to a cultural change that was also quite important. And I don't think the CIA really intended that. What the CIA did intend was to basically the same as what the Nazis were trying to do, was to create a tool to control people's minds, which never really worked. I mean, that's the nice thing about the whole thing, is that MK Ultra was basically a failure because you cannot use LSD as a tool to control people. I mean, not in the kind of naive sense that I give you LSD now and then after half an hour I can ask you and you would like tell me everything I wanted to know. It just doesn't work that way. But they didn't know that. They just knew it works very powerfully on the mind, and the Nazis believed it would work that way. So they designed all kinds of test like series, like could you alter someone's sexual orientation? Could you destroy the ego of someone by giving someone a lot of LSD, which might be possible. Could you destroy the ego of someone by giving someone a lot of LSD, which might be possible. Could you destroy the ego of someone by giving someone a lot of LSD, which might be possible. Could you destroy the ego of someone by giving someone a lot of LSD, which might be possible. could you could you minimize the self-worth of a person? Like they made a lot of experiments on unwitting American citizens, actually, in a way, really continuing the SS tests that the SS did on inmates in the concentration camp. The CIA did it on free Americans in the United States, especially it started at Harvard University. So MK Ultra is a unethical program of human experimentation designed to create controlling techniques. A lot of the files have been destroyed by the CIA, so we don't really know. Well, we don't know everything that went down. Just some stuff survived. Like they created safe houses in New York City, San Francisco, and one other one in the Bay Area across the water, San Francisco. Like in New York, it was in the Greenwich Village. In the 50s, they had an apartment. The CIA operative would invite people from like bohemian bars to come up to a private party and like slip LSD into the drinks, and then there was someone behind a mirror kind of examining how people would change after they take LSD. So stuff like that, kind of really stupid, but very harmful, I would say, intelligence work that traumatized quite a lot of people without these people really knowing, because they had no idea what was happening to them, and also they were never educated. So I guess people would just thought they would go insane for no reason whatsoever. It's not really. I think that MK Ultra really did a lot of damage in the United States because it was quite a big program. My book, I mean, my book is not focused on MK Ultra. I'm not really an MK Ultra specialist. I think MK Ultra is a really difficult thing to understand, especially because a lot of files have been destroyed. There's a book by John Marks, a historian, The Manchurian Candidate, I think it's called, that goes more into detail if you're really interested in that.
Yeah. Maybe touch on the kind of the broader context of the war on drugs. It feels like we lost, many decades of potential, beneficial efficacy research with things like Alzheimer's. And yeah, what's your kind of perspective on that now in hindsight, with obviously the like very strict, illegalization of all psychedelics, and then how it seems like we're starting to come out of that period of illegalization?
Well, I think the war on drugs is really, like I mentioned it before, a very old problem that we have as human beings. And that kind of touches also on the new book, Stone Sapiens, which is a broader look on how drugs have always been with us, including in being influential on the evolution of human beings and of our brain, especially the frontal cortex. And then drugs were always, like especially after the end of the Ice Age, there were always drugs around. This is what is called in the Immortality Key the religion without a name. I mean, people have used substances to stimulate their big brain and to develop abstract language and to create bigger groups, and it's always been very beneficial to sapiens. It's actually, I believe, what kept us from extinction was our smart way of using drugs, psychoactive plants. But then there always comes the problem that these plants, or then products made from these plants, drugs, become quite valuable and also sometimes hard to use. And also they are, not undangerous, some of them. So there evolves like people who who have knowledge about these things, or have the power to control them. And this is basically the war on drugs, when hierarchies are created since the beginning of time, basically because of the drugs. So the drugs they're helping us, but at the same time they create people who control them, and that creates hierarchies, which is not good. So and the war on drugs is just one example, like our current example of how a society goes wrong in handling in handling drugs, because right now we have suffering all over the world due to the war on drugs. Thousands of people are in prison. Whole economies of developing countries are crippled because their most valuable commodities are illegal, and therefore drug cartels come up, and it destabilizes countries, especially here in Latin America. So this is war on drugs. War on drugs obviously has to stop, but if we think of moving beyond the current Goliath of the nation-state system, we have to, obviously include the end of prohibition into that scenario.
Yeah. So yeah, let's move on to Stone Sapiens. So this is an unreleased book so far. It's a current project that you're researching and writing, which I'm very excited about. It's also the name of your Substack, which is great. Folks should subscribe. Just like, yeah, a couple of interesting aspects of that kind of prehistory. So you mentioned that it seems, so there's the stoned ape theory from, I think, Terence McKenna, which I think is interesting. Maybe you can explain what that is, if you align with it or not. And then there's things like, you feel like psychoactive substances might have given us an edge over other species of, Homo or Neanderthals and things like that. Well, like, what were those substances? What might have we been taking? What grew in those regions? And like, what ideas do we have around that?
Well, I think very interesting is the time between 300 and 200,000 years ago. The first sapien skull that has been found so far is about 300,000 years old, and it's from Morocco, and it doesn't have a frontal cortex yet. And then the next skull is about 100,000 years older, and it was found in East Africa, and it does have a frontal cortex yet. So in those 100,000 years, there was a dramatic change in our brain, and I find it interesting to speculate, because there's no sources really, what could have ignited this change. And the world in sapiens was living in Africa at the time, and it was the Ice Age, which for Africa meant that it was very dry. It wasn't as cold, obviously, as in Europe, but it was not very. The habitats where people could live were quite limited, and mostly life was possible in the West and Central African rainforest, which was already there. It's still the same rainforest. It was a little bit smaller during like the worst times of drought, but it was still a place of life and where people could actually live, and they did live there. And during those 100,000 years, sapiens was reduced at times to a very small population size. Sometimes there were not more than a few thousand individuals, and they were all basically living in the rainforest for a very long time. And does any one of you know what was growing in that West and Central African rainforest about 250,000 years ago? Well, this is what McKenna says, that we all took like psilocybin mushrooms that made our brain grow, but I don't think it's true. I don't think that neuroscience shows that mushrooms actually promote the growth of brain matter, but there is one psychedelic compound, and I believe it's the only one so far that has been found to have these qualities that actually promotes the growth of brain matter, and that is iboga, and that is exactly the West and Central African plant that grows in that rainforest, and that actually has been growing there for about 60 million years. So the Ice Age did not discontinue the growth of iboga, and the iboga cult in Gabon is still today is a national religion. So it goes back like a long time. They say it goes back for thousands of years. I think it goes back for longer. So I'm kind of convinced that iboga actually made our frontal cortex grow. And I discussed this with an evolutionary biologist for Stone Sapiens, and we kind of looked at the population size and the times, and he had never heard of it before, but he agreed that this was the most probable candidate if we believe in the stoned ape theory. And I think a lot speaks for the stoned ape theory, because nutrition is of great importance to our development. So I think it's this, and I discussed this with Dennis McKenna, the brother of Terence McKenna, at a conference, the MAPS conference in Denver, and he was totally shocked. He said, "No, it was mushrooms. It was mushrooms," because he's trying to defend the legacy of his brother. But I'm pretty sure it was ibogaine. Ibogaine is the most powerful drug, I think, that exists on this planet.
What does ibogaine feel like? Have you tried it?
I actually have tried it. It's they call it the Mount Everest of psychedelics. So I was a bit in awe before I took it, and it does require preparation, and it can also kill you because it has an effect on the heart. So if you have a heart problem, you shouldn't take it. So you should only take ibogaine in a very controlled setting. I took it in an ibogaine clinic in Mexico called Ambio, together with the 5 U.S. Special Forces vets who were all suffering from traumatic brain injuries. It was quite weird, actually, because I never, I'm very different from U.S. Special Forces vets. But we became really good friends over these 5 days of taking ibogaine together. And one of them, I really liked this guy. I mean, I liked all of them, but he was really a sweet guy. And he had received a bullet in the head in Afghanistan and had for 14 years suffered from severe migraine every day, and depression and substance abuse and everything that comes with it, and like his wife suffering with him, and we took ibogaine. We took it together. It lasts for the whole night. You take like these capsules of ibogaine, and after like 1.5 hours, suddenly the ibogaine starts working, and you can just like lie down and kind of let the ibogaine. I closed my eyes and I saw how the ibogaine. I really enjoyed it. People are not so, like, some people say it's not the greatest trip because it's a weird trip. It's not like a psychedelic, not a typical psychedelic, but it's more like it goes into your brain and it kind of heals your brain. I mean, at Stanford University, they made experiments made brain scans of vets also before they took ibogaine and right after, and they came to the conclusion that it raises your IQ by 7% on average, and it restores all the neuronal pathways that have been like destroyed through traumatic brain injuries or through trauma or through whatever substance abuse. So ibogaine seems to kind of know our brain. It's like it's a very mysterious medicine, and I'm also friends with the leading ibogaine researcher in the world, Dalibor Sames from Columbia University. He also he's like for 10 years he's examining what actually ibogaine does in the brain, and he calls it matrix pharmacology. So ibogaine kind of goes at all like it touches all parts of the brain at the same time, and that's why you only need to take it once to get rid of all addiction. Like if you have an opioid addiction, you take ibogaine once, and it immediately goes to those circuits that always lets you take the drug. Also nicotine, or I have mentioned it before. I was a big cannabis user, and I still think cannabis is a great drug somehow, but I actually use it every day. Also for writing, and I write very well on cannabis, but after I took ibogaine in summer, I don't even think about it anymore. Like, because that kind of, I'm sitting at the desk, I have to write something creative. Of course, I'm going to smoke some weed. I'm going to be more creative. Like that loop is like completely gone. So ibogaine kind of puts your brain, like resets your brain. It's interesting. I mean, you should do more research on it if you're really interested. It's still like the research is happening right now. I mean, the state of Texas just allocated $50 million to ibogaine research, especially tailored for vets, because vets are such a big story in the U.S. And I mean, to come back to Mark, the guy with the bullet in the head from Afghanistan. Like the day after ibogaine, he stayed in his room, and we're like, what's going on with him? Then he just came out in the evening. He just said, I just can't believe it. I don't have a migraine anymore. And I'm still in touch with him, and he's totally fine. So the ibogaine seems to have restored, like, his quite severe, head injury. I can only come to the conclusion that it's a really well-working medicine. And I think that this medicine has been with us, with people in Africa from the beginning of time, and has actually made us smarter and made us being able to make these very early human beings between 300 and 200,000 years ago, made them be able to develop abstract language, to actually develop the frontal cortex, develop community, develop ritual, develop culture. So I'm kind of a believer in this ibogaine story. Like the stoned ape theory comes with ibogaine in my book Stoned Sapiens.
So you feel that because it was a core part potentially of our evolution, that is why it's such a core medicine that seems to know our brains so well?
I think so, yeah. And Dalibor Sames, the professor, he's convinced that this matrix pharmacology, that like what the molecule does, it's hard for me to get my head around, but I find it interesting. Like he believes in the ibogaine intelligence. Like he thinks that the intelligence in that plant molecule will become more and more known to us, and will also help us with like in computer networks, and like he believes that actually the II will help us in our future evolution, because it already helped us in the evolution already. So I think ibogaine is quite interesting, and we just understand very little of it at the moment, even though there's a lot of research on it. And we understand more. I mean, we already understand a lot, but it's a vast field. This plant seems to be really an interesting field of research.
It's fascinating, yeah. Wow, I mean, on the note of our cultures and norms and rituals, you've spoken about how psychedelics might have had something to do with the development of religion, and, that set of ideas and cultures. And I'm curious if you can touch on that a little bit. So maybe fast forward from the prehistory now into kind of more modern history. What are some of the ideas you're thinking about there?
Say that again, please.
Sorry. So how have psychedelics influenced the development of religion, let's say more in the last 5,000 years?
Well, that's like 200 pages of my book. And Uh,
Maybe how? What about Moses, for example?
Moses. Uh, well, one chapter is called Moses' trip. There has been I mean, it's kind of it's interesting. Like wherever you look in human history, there is something with drugs that's of major importance. There's no like sober phase of history, or there's no like. My book is a lot about colonialism, for example, and colonialism, what the British Empire did in America, or what the Spanish did in America, or also what they did in China and Indochina has a lot to do with opium, obviously the most expensive colonial product. So wherever you look, a drug played a role. So I thought it was also kind of interesting when I heard about the studies done by an Israeli researcher about Moses. Moses was living in Egypt, and he killed a man in Egypt. Like he was a Hebrew was beaten by an Egyptian. Then Moses stepped in and killed that Egyptian, and he was running away from the law basically. And he was with friends in the Sinai desert, kind of on a psychedelic retreat, you could say. Like they had been fasting for I think 14 days or something. This is all like noted in the Bible and described quite, or in other texts around the Bible. And then they were probably using acacia. I mean, it's not 100% clear, but like this researcher kind of, from everything how it's described, like how the trip started, and then Moses separated from the group and went up the mountain, and there had the auditory hallucination of hearing the voice and seeing the burning bush, which was not burning, and then returning and kind of believing, like either believing that what he experienced is really valuable, or like thinking that I'm going insane, but then kind of believing that it's really is of value what he just experienced, and kind of relating that to the others who were not tripping as hard, basically. Also with DMT, acacia has DMT, and the acacia that is growing in that region is mentioned like 20 times in that biblical text. So that's how he kind of concludes that they were like really using the acacia for this ritual. Also, doesn't work as strongly on everybody. Like if you've taken ayahuasca, some people are really tripping very hard, while others are hardly feeling anything. And Moses was really feeling a lot because he had a lot to work through, having killed this guy, and so that's Moses' trip. Yeah. But also the church in general, and the Jewish religion actually has quite a liberal handling of drugs, more liberal than Islam and Christianity, because probably unconsciously or even consciously from scholars, drugs seems to have played a role in the genesis of that religion. So it's kind of honored or not as ostracized as by the other two religions.
Yeah, that's interesting. Cool. Well, last question from me, and then we'll open it up to some questions from the audience. You've talked about how we're living through essentially a global crisis, and we don't really have global solutions or global narratives. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that? How do you conceive of that set of problems? And then how do you feel like, or do you feel like psychedelics could help us in that, in the kind of the perspective shift that we need to have?
I mean, I think that we are moving towards a planetary society, and in Stone Sapiens I examined egalitarian systems that have been with us actually for quite a long time. The English philosopher Hobbes wanted us to believe that if we don't have rulers, we're just gonna slaughter ourselves basically, but it's not really true. Humans are quite good at organizing themselves in a non-violent and egalitarian fashion, and they have done that for millennia. The first kings are actually quite, it's quite recent that we have these strong hierarchies. And we can also see in history, especially between end of Ice Age and about 5,000 years ago, so in those 6,000 years, that when hierarchies formed, they were often, humans just left it, like they didn't like it. Like there were quite successful cities where people were living, everyone was sort of equal, the houses had the equal size, and then as soon as it started that some people acquired more wealth and created bigger structures, then the others kind of lost interest and moved away, like created a new village, and cities were actually abandoned because people just didn't like it anymore. Because a lot of people don't like it if other people give them orders or have like more. It's just not nice. So I think the real challenge now is to understand that we actually are capable of organizing ourselves differently, and then how do we get to that point again? Because right now we live in a nation-state dominated world, which creates a lot of problems. I think a lot more problems than it creates good things or solutions. We talked about this before. Nation states are also important because they give us identity. So they're not going to disappear. They probably shouldn't disappear. Just like we all come from certain regions, or we have family structures or regional structures, cultural structures. So I think that's quite valuable. But I think the overimportance of nation states that they have right now must be overcome. That's why structures like Edge City, I think, are actually quite important, and I'm quite happy to be part of it and learn more about it. And we need a lot more of these structures. And I do think that psychedelic freedom must be part of it. I mean, right now there's the nation state saying, I'm gonna put a chemical wall in your brain. You can go this far, but you cannot, do this to your brain. You cannot expand your consciousness like you want. It's just doesn't make sense, It is not. I mean, if a substance is like, the nation state has to protect us. Obviously, it protects us by like telling us we have to wear a seatbelt in the car, and it probably makes sense. No one actually says, this is like I want to have the right to wear no seatbelt. I mean, you can, but it's not such a big deal. It kind of makes sense in a way, but it just certainly doesn't make sense that we cannot use, for example, LSD or DMT or mushrooms or Iboga. It would be great, if there were like Iboga ritual centers everywhere, and we could actually understand this technology. And so this is where we have to go. So I think psychedelic freedom at the end of prohibition is part of the new paradigm that we're moving into. And I just hope that we will still experience it, because the nation state is quite stubborn and has a lot of power. But I think they will become less and less attractive, and then less and less attention will be given to them. And so they will kind of, as you said before, become the IBM. The IBM of the future will be like the nation states. They're still around, but they're not so important anymore. That's my hope, actually.
Yeah, I think there are many folks who agree with that here.
Well, and just to conclude, I think that's why the book's called Stone Sapiens. I think we are actually all stone sapiens. I mean, we wouldn't be here without drugs. So if we understand, I write the book also to create a planetary narrative, because we don't have a lot of very large narratives. We have smaller narrative. I mean, you're creating a large narrative, but that is really important. So I'm also working in that field, and the book will finish with a Stone Sapiens manifesto that kind of tries to bridge the gap between humans that have kind of drifted apart in the last couple of millennia, like create try to create a sense of that we actually are one species and that we should act accordingly.
Yeah, very well said. Well, with that, I'd love to ask the audience if there are any questions from anyone. I think we maybe have a roaming microphone just to make sure you end up on the stream. Yeah, let's go over there.
I just have a quick question. If you had any like historical context on some of the colonialism with the British and then the Indian subcontinent, because it's just been interesting to me how culturally in India and Pakistan and across South Asia, it's so similar, and it used to be a very tight-knit society, but then over time the British were able to really divide everyone, and that so many decades later, just the division between India and Pakistan and all that stuff kind of prevails to the point where you never see it ever going back.
Well, what is interesting is Mohenjo-Daro. I don't know if I pronounce it right. Have you heard of this name? No. It was one of the three so-called high cultures during the Bronze Age. It was in the Indus Valley. It was about around the same time as Egypt and Mesopotamia, and it's still not really examined what was happening there, but it seems to have been an egalitarian high culture in the Indus Valley that was spanning a huge area, actually, like present-day Pakistan and India. This was obviously all one, and it was quite sophisticated and developed. But through the British rule, a lot of archaeology was done in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So the British did not really go for it to really show that there was already a sophisticated civilization, like about 4,000 years ago in that region. So I talk about that in Stone Sapiens, and I also talk about the much more recent opium wars of the British Empire. I mean, the Opium War was against China. The idea was we push opium into China to kind of make the Chinese population addicted to opium and also make a lot of money from it and weaken the Chinese empire. And the opium that was used against China was grown actually in the Indian colony of the empire. So India does play a role in the opium wars as being the ground where the opium is being grown. That's kind of the extent that I write about it in Stone Sapiens.
No, it's interesting. I'm excited to read your book.
Thank you.
Hi. So I bet that you also have experience with DMT. So what's the difference, or how it? What's the difference between DMT and Animoca? Animoca, you say?
Iboga.
Iboga.
I know it's totally different compounds, so it's like comparing apples to strawberries, or comparing.
I mean, right now it's like this fashion that DMT helps you, like open your mind and all that. But you are saying that Animoca is actually like proven to be something that actually like improve how you feel. So there is no any kind of similarity between one and the other.
I mean, there's a few different psychedelics, and they all have different effects, and you can't really say this is better than the other. I'm just not. I don't use a lot of DMT because I just don't like it so much. But other people are really into ayahuasca, and it really helps them and heals them. I just puke, and I feel I'm gonna die, and I'm like asking, why am I doing this to myself? But I'm sure that I'm sure that it's a great medicine, and I'm convinced it's also very healthy. But I have never had such great experiences with it. I have great experiences with LSD, mushrooms, and Iboga. With Iboga, I was lying there, and then the Iboga started. I just thought, this is really good for me. This is healing me. I could see how Iboga like kind of switched my brain into repair mode, and then how the Iboga like repaired everything that was like in my long life had like, the brain is also, you must, it needs, it needs taking care of, and it's very hard. How do you take care of the brain? But Iboga really knows how to do that. But maybe some people have the same experience with DMT. It's just a different molecule. It's a different things happen in the brain. But I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah, really nice talk, my friend. I really enjoyed your discussion of ibogaine as the possible compound that was taken in the early African savanna. So I'm really curious about this because when I read Terence McKenna's book, Food of the Gods, he makes a very picturesque case of why and what happened exactly, or the reasoning behind why our early hominid ancestors actually took psilocybin mushrooms, right? He has this whole story of the rainforest receding, climatological change occurring during that period, and then our ancestors following around these ancient zebu cattle, and then of course finding the mushrooms in the dung, right? So I'm curious what the story is behind the discovery of our hominid ancestors of ibogaine, which is much less conspicuous, right, than mushrooms, being that it's a bark and a tree root. So I'm curious if you're telling that story in your book and what the answer is from your perspective of how our early hominids found ibogaine.
Well, they found it because they lived in the rainforest. If you live in the rainforest over tens of thousands of years, you will get to know the rainforest quite well. It was also a matter of survival. They had to understand which plants are growing around them. So it's not really a surprise. I mean, the legend in Gabon goes that that people were seeing that animals were using it. For example, elephants were eating the leaves of the iboga tree and then were walking backwards. So they were exhibiting unconventional behavior or being creative in a way. And by pulling the leaves, the whole tree was kind of showing its roots, like the roots were visible, so the people saw the roots, and they're like, that's the legend. And then they probably tried the leaves first, but the leaves are not so strong. They don't have that many alkaloids. Ibogaine is the alkaloid of iboga. So most of the ibogaine is actually in the roots. And you can also look at when did humans start eating roots, because first they couldn't really eat them because it's kind of hard to eat a root. But the Homo erectus, who was a human species long before sapiens, they still had very strong like jaws, and they were actually able to chew roots. But then they also discovered fire and were able to cook, and things like roots are actually quite, if you cook them, you can eat them. So this is how it kind of came about. It was the pygmies at first who discovered the iboga in the rainforest, like rainforest people. And they didn't have a ritual yet. They were using it, and also using it in smaller dosages, because ibogaine is quite strong. If you have a flood dose, you cannot move anymore. You're like basically paralyzed. You're like lying there for 10 hours while the ibogaine is working on you. So this they only developed later, when they had like the ability to create a safe space, because if you're like lying there in the jungle for 10 hours on your back while the iboga is working through you need people to watch you. Then the people watching were starting to play music, so the predators would not come. They would light fire so the predators wouldn't come. So this is how the ritual developed, and this is how culture developed, kind of.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you very much, Norman. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about your experience as a writer, talking openly about drug use and also writing about psychedelics specifically. There's a lot of founders, entrepreneurs here that may have had psychedelic experiences, may not have, but the question of whether to be open about those psychedelic experiences sometimes can come up and is a personal choice. So I'm wondering, in your experience with historians, talking about Nazi Germany, or in writing circles, kind of how that's been received and your perspective on being open with psychedelic usage.
Well, the good thing of being an artist is that you can actually be open. Like, you would not get censored. Like, if you were like if you do sports and you would say like, yeah, I do drugs all the time, you would maybe lose your gold medal. In the arts, that's not the case. It's even kind of cool if you're a writer and you use drugs, or if you're an artist, you use drugs. Like, it doesn't hurt your image. So let's put it that way. So I think that's good, so I don't have to be afraid to share it. And I don't mind sharing it. I mean, really though, I really, I even said that I took crystal meth, which is kind of questionable, but I don't take, I only took that really to do the research. But I think me personally, I really like psychedelics, but I don't use psychedelics for writing. It's, I use psychedelics to like go hiking. And while I go hiking, I have ideas that maybe inform my work. That's how I use it. Because if I use, let's say, LSD, I don't want to sit in front of a computer. I just don't, the computer's too ugly, I want to be in nature. So I think psychedelics, what psychedelics basically do is, so this is what happens in the brain. They direct less energy to some people call it the default mode network. Other people would call it the ego, or the command center in the brain. So the command center in the brain, which right now for me is very active because I have to perform here on stage, and and you also with you, it's very active. You're sitting there, but when you take psychedelics, it's not as active. It gets less energy. So other parts of the brain have the chance to become more active, and that creates creative thinking, you could call it. Or just other thinking, you have different thoughts, different perceptions. And for me as an artist, that's great. If you're a truck driver, it probably wouldn't help you because you just have to like stay on the road. But I have to, not stay on the road. That's my job. So for me, psychedelics are great. Does that answer the question? It kind of answers the question.
Maybe methamphetamine for the truck driver.
That's actually, if you read On the Road by Jack Kerouac, that's basically an amphetamine book. They take bennies, which is benzodrine. He wrote it on amphetamines. He wrote it that the legend goes in 2 weeks. If you take amphetamines for 2 weeks, you can, of course, write a novel, you just have to know exactly what you're doing. And he knew, and truck drivers used it in the 50s, especially in the United States, for the long, drives. And I think still truck drivers would use amphetamines.
Should we do one more question and then
drugs,
and then party time? All right, let's go.
I just want to ask your thoughts on sort of the increasing rates of like ADHD, and also in terms of the drug component, like what you think about medication for ADHD, like Ritalin and Adderall and stuff, because there's not like a lot of long-term research on those things from what I understand. And like you said, there's everyone kind of does things to, I guess, increase their brain capacity and stuff. And so I was just wondering.
Yeah, I
if you
don't
had
know.
any thoughts
I'm not an expert on ADHD. I really cannot answer your question. I'm just surprised that speed supposedly works on ADHD people in a calming way. I'm just surprised by this effect, but I don't really know how it works. And Ritalin is a soft amphetamine for sure. No, sorry, I cannot give any knowledge about that.
There was one more question
one more
here.
question.
Was it Inara? Yeah. Go for it.
I had a very I live in Berlin, and the way I ended up
I
there
can see that from your cap.
is that I came I came there when I was 18 on a 3-week history trip where the only thing we did is tour like history museums, SS quarters, and just look at those venues. And there was a place that is an archive where they were holding interrogation of people for the census, and you would sit on a chair and the person would ask you intimidating questions. They would sweat in the chair and they would swab it to then collect your scent, so that if they needed to find people, they would use the
Never
interrogation
heard
chair.
of this.
And you can go to the archive and look at those things as well. But my question was also about how during those times there are recordings of Hitler speaking where he is trembling and sweating and he clearly looks erratic. And I don't know why there hasn't been at least a theory about the fact that he was using something during those speeches.
I mean, yeah, that's the story. That's the story of Blitz. I examined this and come to the conclusion that he did use drugs.
But do you know why it wasn't, like, how on earth could no one have figured this out before you?
Well, I collaborated with Hans Mommsen, who was the leading German historian on National Socialism. My publishing house actually said if you're writing a non-fiction book about this topic, you should work with a leading historian. So he was kind of my mentor. And he said, we historians don't know anything about drugs because they never did the 10 years of Club der Visionäre that I did. So historians just don't have this tool in their toolkit when they see Hitler trembling. And Mommsen said, when he saw like the copies from that I made in the archives, he said, finally this explains, Hitler's erratic behavior and his changes, and because no historians before could actually explain it. So, and historians just don't know anything about drugs. He said, we don't know anything about drugs. That's our problem. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end it. Thank you so much, Norman. This has been, it's been absolutely fascinating, and I'm excited to welcome you to Future Edges as well.
I'd love to come.
Yeah,
Thank you.
amazing. All right, thank you.
Thanks
Thank
so
you
much.
guys for joining.